This includes a lot of learning about topics such as affirmative action, racial injustice, mental health, and similar topics. So we try to combine a lot of our experiences, stories, and even data from different sources to have a better understanding of problems with our community. And we try to create presentations and discussions in order to help address these issues. So our ultimate goal is to become mediators in the conversation between Asian and immigrant parents and a lot of children in order to break down communication barriers that can arise from a cultural or generational gap.
So first we'll be going over some general tips on how to have healthy communication, and later we'll be going over some common situations where we can then apply these tips. Before even having discussions, it's important to do some preparation beforehand. And the first step is being aware of each other's love languages. We all express ourselves differently, so it's really important for us to not misinterpret or make assumptions about each other. And that's why we need to have these conversations, such as about love languages. And what a love language is how you express how you feel loved and how you feel that you are loved. So some examples of love languages are words of affirmation, gift giving, acts of service, quality time, and physical touch. And it's really important as a parent to encourage your child by using their love languages. And as students, it's important for us to realize that our parents might show love in a different way than we expect through our love language. For example, my love language is words of affirmation. So I really feel loved when someone directly comes out and just says, I love you, or other statements similar to that. Whereas my mom's love language is acts of service. So she shows her love through maybe like cutting fruit and sending them to me or refilling my water. And that's in a very different way than I feel loved. So in a lot of Asian households, parents rarely say, I love you directly, but they show their love in different ways. And it took me a while to realize that through like cutting fruit and sending me water, that's how my mom shows her love. So it's important for us as students to identify that they're telling us that they love us in their own love language, and having conversations about each other's love languages can really help clear up that miscommunication. And understanding each other's love languages can enable healthier communication and more openness and affection between the two parties. So a great way to better understand each other is having personality tests or taking them. Two really popular personality tests are Enneagram and 16 personalities. And so for my family, a couple months ago, we realized that we each took the 16 personalities test, and we didn't even realize that. So we talked about our different types and what we got. And it was really interesting to see that, see how we perceived each other, how we perceived ourselves, and how both of those related to the type that we got. And so, for example, mine is the advocate, which you can see in the bottom right. And so the advocate strengths are being insightful, principled, and altruistic, but some of the weaknesses are being sensitive to criticism, reluctant to open up, and being a perfectionist, all of which are my weaknesses. Um, and so talking about my weaknesses were really important for my parents and my sister to perceive me and see why I react to an argument the way I do. And so talking about our strengths and weaknesses that the 16 personalities tests showed to us was really beneficial and insightful. And it allowed me personally to be more conscious of the decisions I'm making in a conversation. And that really helps with healthier communication. So if you see the T in the INFJT, that means turbulent, and turbulent advocates are likely to question themselves more and are usually more sensitive to stressors. So that means in an argument, if I feel like I'm being judged, I get really defensive and really stressed out. So learning my weakness is important for me to have a conversation more productively and realize maybe I shouldn't be shutting down so quickly. So after learning each other's love languages and each other's personality, we should be conscious of how we naturally respond to conflict and kind of what category we subconsciously fall into. There's four main ways of responding out of habit to conflict. There's conflict avoidance, competitive confrontation, passive, and passive aggressive. So the first is conflict avoiding, and this is the case where you don't even really try to respond to conflict, you just try to avoid the conflict entirely. And this is because you want to avoid the stress and the tension of dealing with conflict, often because you want to prioritize preserving relationships. And people with conflict avoiding response have a need for connection, safety, belonging, and they often fear change that can be caused due to having a conflict. And having a conflict avoidance response can cause resentment to eat at the relationship and lead to emotional deadness for the person because their feelings are always being suppressed and they can never air out their concerns. The next is competitive confrontation, and this is the case where you're very aggressive and you focus on your own needs to be met at any cost, even perhaps sacrificing an important relationship. People with competitive confrontation often have a I'm right, you're wrong mentality, which is something I definitely struggle with in my personal conversations. And although people with competitive confrontation present a very strong aggressive front, their underlying emotions come from a place of fear and defensiveness. People who are competitive confrontation like are disconnected from empathy and they lose other relationships to get their own needs met. And often this can lead to feelings of isolation and loneliness. The next is the passive response, and this is where you give up your own needs to save relationships with others. So, this is kind of similar to conflict avoidance, except you do engage in conversation, although you tend to blame yourself in conflict to try to get over the conflict as quickly as possible. People who are passive often have a need for belonging, safety, and connection. But being passive can cause resentment and detachment in relationships because you're always suppressing your own needs to meet the other party's needs. Lastly, is passive aggressive, and this is when we needs without having a direct confrontation. So, the strengths of passive aggressive people are that they have an intuition about the dynamics of the relationship and they are connected to their own feelings and their own needs, but their underlying emotion is a sense of helplessness. And that causes them to trust themselves less, to stand up for themselves directly. So, they try to go a roundabout way of expressing their needs. For example, if you're with a roommate and your roommate is really messy and never cleans up after themselves, you might be too scared to have a conversation. So, a way to be passive aggressive is cleaning up your own dishes and leaving theirs in the sink to kind of subtly tell them you need to clean up after yourself. And so, all of these four responses, none of them are kind of the best way or the perfect way to respond to conflict. So what we want to do is we want to analyze which category we fall into. For example, I tend to be competitive confrontation or passive aggressive. And we want to analyze why we're falling into these habits and what are our underlying emotions that are causing us to react that way. We want to make sure we understand what needs we need to be met. And instead of either avoiding or being very aggressive, we want to vocalize our internal thoughts so that we can sort them out with, with the other party and be able to collaborate and accommodate each other. So when we're having discussions, we don't want to fall into one of these natural responses. We want to make sure that every decision we're making and every statement saying comes from a place of conscious thought and is something that we genuinely want to express in a conversation. Next is the importance of tone in having a conversation. So, what tone is the attitude that you want to convey or express. And it's a reflection of your attitude to either the subject matter or who you're talking to. So, the whole point of tone, and keeping in mind the importance, is that how you come across is as important as what you're trying to get across. Some questions to keep in mind about your tone is what is my tone right now and how am I coming across? Is that different from how I want to come across? And if so, it's important to balance that out. And we want to make sure that the person you're talking to is really understanding your content rather than being affected by tone. So, for example, if I'm having a conflict with my mom, a lot of times when I'm talking, her first instinct is to give me advice. And if I detect any sense of judgment in her tone, I might immediately shut down and not listen to any of the good advice she has to say simply because of her tone. So that's why it's important to make sure that our tone is something that the other party will be receptive to. One scenario for the importance of tone is if you stay out too long with your friends and you neglect your schoolwork, your parent might be frustrated at you and try to lecture you. And so for me, if this happens, my natural response is to be like, I'm sorry, geez. And that's a very disingenuous response. My mom can tell I don't mean it. I can tell I don't mean it. And it's just a response for me to try to get the conversation over with, move on, and just like forget it ever happened. But this is very unproductive, and a lot of these feelings will fester. So I want to analyze why am I saying I'm sorry? It's to get the conversation over with, but I'm not actually reaching a resolution with my mom. If perhaps I look deeper into the issue of why I'm staying out, I can tell my parents I'm neglecting my schoolwork because I don't know how to do it and I'm frustrated that I can't do it. So that's why I'm procrastinating. And then we can move on to a solution of how we do approach that issue and try to resolve that. And that's a lot more productive of a conversation than just being very passive aggressive and trying to just get the conversation over with. So, after understanding each other's love languages, understanding how we respond to conflict, and understanding our tone, we want to talk about what to actually do during the conversation. Before we start the conversation, as a listener, you want to ask, who does the person initiating the conversation need at the moment? For example, do they need a listener, someone to give advice, or someone to empathize with you? So, for example, I have two really close friends. One is a quiet listener, and so I go to her when I really need to rant. I'm extremely frustrated, and I need to talk to someone who can calm me down, help me rationalize, and be objective about the situation. So she often tells me if I'm overreacting, which I tend to do a lot. Another friend I have is kind of the opposite. She's a very fiery spirit, so I go to her when I know that she'll have my back. She'll advocate me and kind of validate my feelings. So if I'm really angry about something and I just want someone to support me and tell me that I'm feeling valid, then I'll go to her. So, if you are a parent and you want to have a lot of conversations with your child, it's important for you to be able to adapt to these different roles. And that's why it's really important for you to ask before the conversation has started who they need at the moment so you can be that for them and allow them to feel like they're having a good conversation with you. So, some general tips are understanding where compromises can happen as a listener and being able to perceive those. This is especially important for disagreements and conflict. And also for conversations that can become very emotional, it's important for us to set aside time specifically to have this conversation. And that way, when emotions can be really over the top, we can take some time to calm down and revisit the conversation later. Listening and responding is also super important in talking about mental health, which can be a very tricky subject to approach. As a listener, we want to be very welcoming, but provide space. So, as a parent, it's important to make sure that your child knows that you're always there for them, but never pressure them into talking about their mental health. Just make sure that they know they can come to you when they're ready. We also want to ensure that the person talking about their mental health, their needs can be met. So, if you are the one initiating the conversation, you want to lay out how your needs can be met. And if you don't do that, the listener should be able to ask how they can help you meet your needs. Lastly, as a listener, you do want to make sure that the person talking about their mental health feel safe. They're safe to themselves, and they're also safe to others. Um, so next are general tips to be an active listener, and these are tips you can take for your own conversations in the household and really use them concretely. The first is reframing what's being said and asking clarifying questions. This helps show the person talking that you're an engaged listener and you're really trying to listen. The next is reaffirming that the person talking, their reactions are valid, and that way the person feels more incentivized to keep talking with you and talking through these issues when they know that they're not being judged or attacked. Next is writing down your thoughts and organizing them on paper. This is super important when you're having disagreements or conflict. You can make 3 columns of feelings, interests, and goals. And that way you can kind of map out and see your discussion on paper. And this can lead to a more organized conversation and you don't stray from the subject matter. You also want to be very aware of your body language. If you're yawning, you're slouching, and sighing, those are all indicators to the person talking that you're not interested, and that can dissuade them from wanting to talk to you in the future. So what we want to do with our body language is make sure that we show that we're being engaged, such as leaning in, nodding, and those are all indicators that you're genuinely listening and you're trying to understand what they're saying. At the same time, we don't want to be too engaged and talk over them. So we want to make sure that we engage the right amount so that they do feel they're being heard, but they don't feel like you're suppressing what they're saying. And again, being an active listener is not a time for advice unless they genuinely say that that's what they're seeking at the moment. Another great way to be an active listener, these are all very general tips, but you can kind of think for yourself. You can think for yourself, what does active listening look like when you're talking? Um, what kind of listener do you want to be able to talk to and be that listener for someone else? Now, these are some resources for mental health. I suggest a screenshot of this slide because it has important hotlines and some great tips for approaching mental health. The first is Headspace, and that is an online meditation guide, so that can help you soothe your emotions, and it'll help you not even in conversation, but just maintaining a healthy and calm lifestyle. Talkspace is an online platform where you can talk about your issues with mental health to someone who will listen on the other side. And the next are really important hotlines that you can call. And these are, they're different for different situations. So you can call them for different issues. Next is for when you do have conversations in the household, it's important to be aware of sensory therapy, and that's kind of having putty or fidget toys that the person talking about their mental health can play with, and that can alleviate anxiety and help them feel more safe talking about their issues. You can also have different exercises that you can follow when you're having really tough conversations, such as meditation guides, grounding exercises, and breathing exercises to kind of keep the person calm and soothe their anxiety when they're talking about really heavy issues. Another great tip is having a secondary location that you can talk. A lot of times being at home may be a source of great stress. And so moving to a secondary location like a park can be a place for someone to feel more safe and comfortable opening up. For example, if I'm feeling like I really need to talk about my issues, my sister and I might take a walk and go to Target. So even just browsing through the aisles is a way for me to feel like I can open up more about my issues. Lastly, it's really important for parents to know that they might not always be the first choice for their student to go and it's important to accept that they might go to school counselors, therapists, or teachers to talk first. And it's important that you don't pressure them to come to you first. Just make sure that they know that they're welcome to talk to you, but let them come to you when you're ready, when they're ready. Sorry. And therapists are a really great resource to talk to. I know therapy can come with a lot of stigma, but I have a lot of friends who do have therapists, and initially they were resistant to the idea, but later on they talked about how having a therapist really helped them with their mental health and finding solutions to the problems that they were facing.
Okay, so when you're having a conversation about conflicts that arise, it is important to be aware of how you act, and here are some tips that can be helpful. First of all, when you're having conflict, you want to be curious, patient, and open-minded. This will help you understand the other person's side better and helps you have a meaningful conversation. Treat them the way you would like to be treated by not assuming what the other person is going to say or preemptively judge what they're saying. Focus on one issue or complaint at a time, look at things from their perspective, only speak for yourself, and make sure that the other person feels heard. It can be helpful to have a safe word, which is something you can say when the conversation starts to get intense, you become overwhelmed, or for when you start to feel uncomfortable continuing the conversation. It can be any random word. For example, I might use words like red or pineapple, and they are all usually words that you wouldn't use in normal conversations. An alternative could also be having safe gestures instead of words. It can be anything, maybe something like putting the palms of your hands together. Also, having timeouts is totally acceptable when you need to take a break to gather your thoughts. However, make sure to revisit the conversation later on so that you aren't just leaving the topic and ignoring it. It might be helpful to set a timer or something if you prefer, and make sure to show intentions that you still want to continue the conversation. And you can maybe say something like, oh, can we talk about this tomorrow morning, or something with a specific time. And don't take it personally if someone says that they want a timeout or that if they want to end the conversation. As for closure, the ultimate goal is to come to or at least attempt to have mutual understanding of how the other person is feeling and about their side of the story. Know that every conversation is not going to end with an agreement or resolution, and that is totally okay. The main goal of having these conversations is not to necessarily solve the problem. It is just a helpful tool to get somewhere in the conflict. And if it helps, you can take notes and go back to things or ask clarifying questions to help you understand the other person better. But if you do end up taking notes, make sure to destroy it and get rid of it later for confidentiality. Also, take into account that oftentimes what is implied is more important than what is said. A lot of the time, people might have a hard time saying exactly what they mean or feel. Lastly, having a third party or receiving help from a licensed therapist can be very beneficial when you are having difficulty with the conversation. They can really be a big help. However, having a licensed therapist would ideally be better because third parties are most times biased. So those are some important tips, and I hope that these tips will help you have an effective conversation for conflict transformation.
Next, we'll be going over how to use some of these discussion tips in common discussions. So first, I'll be going over using these tips in discussions about media. So things such as social media and also playing video games. So oftentimes, either in my household or in people I know, like my friends, a lot of parents and children argue about using too much of their screens in places like social media or video games. So I think it's a good idea to go over some of both the benefits and the disadvantages of using these platforms. So for social media, there are definitely a lot of great benefits. And one of these is that you become a lot more educated and aware of a lot of modern issues or social movements and trends. But at the same time, it's also very important to keep certain things in mind when using social media. So first of all, it's very important to understand your own beliefs and ideas, because what often happens when you're using social media is that the apps are designed to give you more content that aligns with what you already believe. So it's very easy for you to develop a biased view based on your usage of social media. So it's just a good idea to stay informed and remember to fact check things before spreading a post or sharing something with your friends or family as education. Another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of parents and children tend to use different forms of social media. So, for example, in my household, I use a lot of Instagram or Messenger or Facebook, while my parents often use a lot of WeChat. And I know a lot of other parents use WhatsApp. So, as a result, based on different people using these platforms, you can see different kinds of posts and different types of information being spread. So, it's important to keep in mind how those differences can come based on the platform you're using too. And there's another thing to be aware of, which is misinformation. So one great example of this is a Wayfair scandal that happened last year using a lot of platforms such as Instagram. So what happened was there was this company called Wayfair, which sells a lot of products online. And there was a huge trend on social media, particularly Instagram, where people were reposting about how a certain brand of furniture was naming its pieces of furniture after children's names, and there were a lot of these missing children reports which lined up with the same names. So a lot of people believed that there was child and human trafficking going on, and this story spread like wildfire on social media. But it turns out that it was actually just a rumor and it was debunked pretty quickly. But it was really scary because it showed how easy it was for this piece of misinformation to spread on social media. And I personally had a lot of friends reposting about the same scandal, so it was very eye-opening to see how even a piece of false information could spread so quickly. And it's also important to keep in mind parasocial relationships. So a parasocial relationship is a very one-sided relationship. So for example, if you follow a certain celebrity on social media and you pour in a ton of your own emotional investment into this relationship while knowing that there's no way they can actually know who you are, and so you're just funneling a lot of your own emotions and your own effort into a relationship without getting anything back. So it's very important to stray away from this, and that's also another danger of social media. So next, I'll be going over some pros and cons of video games so that you can better understand this topic. So there's a lot of benefits of using video games and playing video games. So for a lot of children, it's a very great way to relieve stress and have a lot of comfort in an environment, because oftentimes video games are very structured. So it can be very easy for someone to find it comfortable and have no surprises. And when you're in such a structured environment, it's very easy to put in a certain amount of work and get a very expected result and achieve success in this environment. So it can be a very satisfying way for people to de-stress. And there's also been a lot of applications of video games being used in therapy, just because of how easy it is for patients to open up while playing video games. So that just goes to show how comforting video games can be when used in the right circumstances. And it's also a great way for people to stay connected with their peers, because oftentimes, especially during COVID-19, it's very hard to stay connected with people in real life. So video games and social media are great outlets to stay connected with people you know. But there's also very valid reasons why parents are often wary of using too much social media or video games. So a few of these include that it's seen as a waste of time when you spend too much time using social media or playing video games, and you could be funneling that time into more productive matters and keeping up responsibilities in your life elsewhere. And it can also be seen as mindless if you're not using moderation and you're not controlling how much time you spend putting into video games or social media. So how come video games are so engaging or addictive? So as I mentioned before, there's definitely a great sense of control within games, and there's a lot of structure. So if you follow the same path of inputs and you put in the same amount of effort, you can always expect to get a certain result, and it's very satisfying. It can release a lot of dopamine when you get a certain reward. So a lot of times these video games are designed to reward the player greatly, and it makes them emotionally feel very comfortable while playing. And especially during quarantine, it's a great way to stay connected with friends. So a great way to have discussions between parents and children about playing too many video games or spending too much time on social media is to start with agreements. So it's great to try to establish a reasonable schedule and try to understand or make sure both parties are on board with how much video game time is too much and what's a reasonable amount of time to spend on other parts of your life. And overall, it's a lot more productive when you start these conversations with agreements rather than starting off with an argument. Yeah, so it's very common that people will get into arguments, parents and children, about spending too much time playing video games. So, in a lot of cases, including me when I was in middle school, I think a lot of parents are very concerned about when their children play too many video games. So this might be they might think that you're not spending enough time in other areas of your life when you're channeling a lot of it into playing video games. But there's a lot of kind of misconceptions that might occur that people might not stop to think about, both from the parent and the children perspective. So, for example, when I was in this situation, I often felt like I knew that playing too many video games was being harmful for the rest of my or for other responsibilities I had to uphold, but I didn't really have like the tools or the experience to necessarily cut down on video games myself without any help. So I was aware of the problem for sure, but sometimes it's hard to communicate that you're aware of the problem and are looking to fix it if your parents simply see that there is the problem and it's not being fixed. So it can be easy to have miscommunications about your understanding from both sides. So a lot of times children might be scared of judgment too from their parents, and they might really value having their parents understand their issues and value feeling heard and then looking for a solution. But sometimes from the parent perspective, it might look like there's just a problem that's not being solved. So it's very important for both sides. From the children's perspective, maybe understanding that your parents might not be trying to judge you, but might just be looking for the best way to solve the problem they see. And also from the parents' perspective, understanding that the children sometimes think a lot about how they have this problem, but they're not sure how to fix it, or sometimes they're scared of being judged. So making sure to hear them out and try to understand things from their perspective. So trying to work from agreements and trying to understand both sides rather than starting off with disagreements.
As well as in video games and social media, healthy communication is important when talking about academics as well. Academics is a very common conversation between students and parents, and it can sometimes be difficult for it to be a meaningful conversation without causing much conflict. When talking about academics, parents and students often lose track and forget to try to understand each other. So, what students want to think about is what the parent is trying to achieve. Typically, the parent brings up the conversation of academics because they want their child to get better grades and work harder so that they can achieve their goals in the future and become successful. Although most times for the students, it can feel like they're being yelled at. We have to try to remind ourselves that they care about our grades because they care about us. They're not just talking about our grades to make us feel bad. And on the other hand, the parent should consider how the child feels when talking about academics as well. Oftentimes, the students might not feel comfortable opening up because they're afraid of judgment and they think that they won't be listened to, which is why it is important for the parent to be mindful, understanding, and try to be a listener. It is important to think about what the other person is feeling or why they're bringing up the topic, but it also might be helpful for students to ask themselves questions like, where am I struggling? How can I strengthen myself in these areas? And do I need to seek outside help? These questions could help the students to self-improve in areas that they might feel like they need more work with. So there are two ways that academics are often talked about, one of which is constructive and the other which is by comparison. In a constructive conversation, the child might feel like they are already working hard enough and doing their very best, and that their parent is just criticizing all the work and effort they are putting in. They might feel frustrated and feel as if the parent is not supporting them, which is never actually the case. To avoid this, it is important for the parent to talk in a way that reassures the student that their hard work is recognized and that they have support. In a comparison conversation, the child might be compared to a sibling or a peer. Before making these comparisons, take into account natural differences between people, such as in learning style, interest, etc. Everyone has their own way of doing things, and by comparing, it can make the child feel like they are not good enough and that they aren't living up to their parents' standards. It can make them feel like their worth only comes from the career, academic, and success, although these are not really factors that determine students. Children are often aware of shortcomings, so repetition of things is not more helpful. Be aware that rather than repeating and emphasizing these problems or shortcomings, talking and coming up with a plan together to improvise or resolve the problem would be beneficial for both. Also, academics can be a sensitive topic for some students, so having designated times where you talk about this academic topic can be helpful for some people. You can do this by picking a certain time. For example, it can be like Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, from 6 to 6:30 or something like that. Have all other times be safe without any conversation about academics. This way, the student and parent will both know when what is going to be talked about, and it can be less overwhelming for them. So an example of comparison being used would be when saying, if parents say something like, oh, your brother got an award and you didn't, you need to do better. Or talking about how someone is getting better grades than them, getting better test scores, and or doing better extracurriculars. Keep in mind that there is often more context for people that you might not fully understand, and there could be things going on in your child's life that they might not be comfortable sharing. So in these conversations, rather than talking about academics constructively or by comparing to a peer, try to discuss and come up with solutions together. Say things like, is there anything I can do to help you out? Hey, what's going on? And look for their needs so that the student feels like they're getting the support they need.
So it's also very important to debrief after every conversation you have. So this is usually just a form of self-reflection. And these are some important topics that you can go over with yourself about the conversation you just had. So first, does it feel like a burden has been lifted or that there is more pressure after the conversation? Since this can impact whether someone will be more open to having future conversations about what they talked about. It can also be very important to remember that conflict will affect relationships and it can have some lasting effects. So just be aware that conflict is normal, but it might impact how future conversations will go, and it can create a tension that you can try to resolve later. So it's good to remember certain points that might make someone more wary in the future and try to work on resolving that. So conflict can also strengthen relationships ultimately. Another important thing to realize is that if you self-reflect on the conversation and realize that you've behaved in a way that could be harmful to someone, even if you didn't really mean it. So if you worded an argument kind of in a pointed way that might make the other person feel attacked, it's very important to realize that you can go back and apologize to the person, and it's very healthy to do so in order to maintain your relationship. So if you understand that you've done something, even if you don't think it was harmful, but it can be perceived by the other person as harmful, it's very great to go back and apologize, just so you can have more healthy conversations in the future. It's also a good idea if you took any notes to go back and look through them and review some of your goals or feelings or emotions while having the conversation. And you can see whether any of these things have changed or been improved or have been compromised throughout the conversation. And if you did happen to take any notes, it's a great idea to destroy them after a conversation for confidentiality. And so you maintain the trust of the relationship. And if you've had a talk or a discussion about mental health, it's very important that you try to feel out whether the other party felt heard or whether they felt overlooked or maybe hurt after sharing their side, because it's very hard for someone to open up and it takes a lot of courage. But if they feel overlooked, they can be a lot less likely to share their perspective in the future. And that can be very harmful to them to bottle up their emotions. But if you help them feel looked or you help them feel heard after the conversation and they're more comfortable opening up to you, that's a great start to helping work on whatever issues they might be facing. And debriefing can also occur in the middle of conversations. So it's totally normal to maybe mentally stop midway through a conversation and think about how things are going and how some of your initial goals might have changed as you were talking through a topic, or maybe how some of your feelings and emotions have been affected by the conversation. So we got a lot of our discussion tips, especially those at the very beginning that Angela talked about, from a book that we've been reading as a group called Say What You Mean. So this is the cover image for that book. So you can definitely take a screenshot if you want and take a look at this. And there's a lot of great discussion tips contained in this book about things like intention and different ways that people deal with conflict and different tools for having effective conversations. So this is definitely a great resource if you want to learn more about some of the topics we talked about. And we all definitely recommend taking a look at this book.
Thank you guys so much for coming to our seminar. Your students have been working so hard on this for weeks and weeks, and we hope that this is beginning of healthy conversations, of also just developing communication skills within family, friends, and any other relationships that we have. So we're going to take a break and move on to our Q&A section. So if you guys have any questions, please just put them in the chat and we'll do our best to respond to them as adequately as possible. Also, by the way, I'm Johnny Brera. I'm one of the co-advisors for BayEcho. I specialize in culture, communications, and peace and conflict studies.
So if you have any questions, either for the speakers or even just for me and Johnny, feel free to ask them. I've also enabled the unmuting aspect, so if you're not able to get to the chat for any reason, you can also feel free to do that. Just be respectful if someone else might be talking. All right, I guess it seems like there's not really any questions. But yeah, so I think, oh wait, actually let me check the Q&A from the registration. They said that we would have what I wanted. All right, so I have someone who wrote tips on how to help teens manage social media, gaming, screen time in general. So maybe if you have the three of you speaking, or other BayEcho's members who are also in the audience, if you have advice on how to do that. And then their second part was how to some tips on how to help their teens with self-esteem, self-confidence, and imposter syndrome.
I think I can respond to the first question about social media time management because I definitely struggle with spending too much time on social media. So for me, I have an iPhone, and like in the settings, I can control a time limit. So I set it for 2.5 hours per day. And so when you've used up that time, it'll let you know that you reached the time limit, and that way I can kind of know I can't spend any more time for that day and I have to wait till the next day to go on social media again. But yeah, I think it's really great to talk about it with your student or have them actively try to manage manage their social media, so that way it can be kind of a healthy way of limiting their time. um, and yeah, so it's great to set time limits. Also, for iPhone and Apple products, you can see your weekly screen time. And so you can discuss that with your child. If it seems like it's way too much, you can kind of brainstorm ways to fix that. But every week you can see how much time you spent, and that can be a great mark to discuss if it's too high or it's okay.
Mhm. Yeah, and if you're, excuse me, if you're a parent who is trying to help their students with, limiting time to technology, it's definitely really hard, and it's much harder to force it than to collaborate and say maybe we can work out an agreement. And especially if you have a high school teenager, um, give them the power of being able to decide, like maybe we'll do an hour of no screen time, no exceptions, um, in like every evening, or on each school night or something, um, just so that it's a shared responsibility and not just um, the parent or you as a parent deciding on that.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with both Angela and Joy that it's very productive when it's the student who's trying to come up with a solution and the parents are more in a helping role rather than like the parent necessarily driving everything. I think for me personally, if I were to like, I think I had like periods of time where I used a ton of social media or video games, and if I were to just like spend one day keeping track of all the time I spent putting it into like video games or social media, like if I just saw that number, like sometimes it would be like 3 or 4 hours maybe, and like during its worst. So if I saw that number myself, I would feel like, yeah, I definitely need to work on this problem. And then I might reach out to my parents for help if I knew that they weren't gonna like judge me too hard. So maybe if you were to encourage like your children to try to set out like find a solution on their own, and then you can just like be in a supporting role and try not to judge them. I think that's the most helpful. So I think, yeah, I think usually people will understand when is too much if you lay it out like pretty clearly and don't like force anything on them.
Mhm. Thank you both. Um, and then the other part of that was advice on helping your teens self-esteem, self-confidence, and imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome, I might not be the best at describing this, is basically when you might be good at something, or you have certain qualifying and like really good qualities, but you don't want to give yourself the credit. And it's kind of like where you you feel like you don't deserve the good things that you have, or the good things that you've worked towards in life. And I think, especially as parents, it's really like a great step, first of all, to want to um, help your students and your children with that. And I think something that helps and can be very difficult, typically for like Asian parents, is to give words of affirmation, kind of like it is a love um, language of hearing, things that people appreciate about you. But a better way, if you might not be comfortable yet with, regularly affirming your children, would be like, leaving notes or something. There's a parent who got famous online for leaving really sweet notes when they pack their children's lunch. I know that's probably a little less applicable if you're doing school online every day to pack somebody's lunch, but maybe leaving a little post-it note of "you're doing great" in the mirror, even if it's just a really small like word of affirmation, it can go a long way, right? It's just like it takes 7 positive things to cancel out or make up for one negative um, thought or one negative comment. So especially as parents who I'm not a parent, but you want to be as encouraging as possible, and that takes sometimes a lot to start out. But baby steps, which is why if writing it on a note is a little bit easier than saying it out loud, I would definitely start with that. um, and then I just got, I think it's from a high school freshman or from a parent of a high school freshman. They said they're not motivated to study and sometimes not even complete homework, or they delay it to the last minute. I relate to that. Any suggestions?
To be honest, that's something I struggle with a lot is procrastination. That's probably one of my biggest obstacles. I think maybe as a parent supporting, um, like you can go down to the reason why they're struggling. So for me, like if it's easy homework, I'll immediately get it done. And if I'm confident in myself that I can do it, I'll get it done. But if it's hard for me or I don't know how to approach it, I'll leave it to the last minute. So maybe as a parent, like talking through why they're struggling with their homework. As a student, um, maybe setting aside like a reward, like if I finish this now, I can go do this later, like guilt free. Um, or maybe like listen to music while you're doing it. Um, I'm not sure if that's like the most productive, but that can help me get motivated to do my work if I'm listening to good music. I think also along the lines of the previous question, like um, I think it's important for parents to maybe like give words of affirmation when you've done something good, like not treat it as an expectation, but treat it as something like you're proud that they did. And that can go for like the homework thing too. Like, not just say like, oh, it's expected to do your homework, but like congratulate them when they've finished. And that can be more of an incentive.
Mhm. Yeah, when I was in high school, um, I was a big procrastinator. I hated doing homework and I really lacked motivation. I even struggle with that now, to it for a lack of motivation, to get things done. And sometimes, I mean, it depends. I'm not going to assume what the reason is for your student, but I know some people, they struggle with um, getting things done because they might think in their head, like they might, well, for one, like they might be struggling with mental health. And then another one I know a lot of people struggle with is they have a fear, they might have a fear of failure. So one coping mechanism is, well, if I don't start it, I can't fail it, right? Which is not, it's not actually a reasonable thought. It's just, a tendency, like a coping mechanism. Um, so I think a couple things, and I agree with Angela. For me, it was so much easier to start and finish my homework when I was good at it and when I liked it. So that could be another reason. Maybe they're just struggling with even how to do it. Um, how to do the thing. Like I hated to do science homework because I was awful at science. And then I majored in music when I was in college, and doing homework for me was like fun in college. So I would just do that on time and get to sleep at a normal time. Also, I was older and learned to deal with my own time management. Um, Also, working out a time management schedule with them if they're willing, that might work. Um, and also sometimes just encourage them to start it. Like do one problem, write one sentence, um, make one little start on how to do what they're gonna do, whatever. And that start is usually the hardest part, right? I don't know if the high schoolers here agree, but getting started is the hardest thing about homework. And then once you start homework, it's usually like, all right, well, I might as well continue doing it, right? Um, so I definitely think sometimes it's just motivate them to like write their name on the paper and write, I don't know, maybe mostly homework is electronic now, but just get started, open the file and read the instructions. Do like one small step at a time. That makes things less intimidating and a little easier to do for sure.
Yeah, I would also recommend setting up mini goals, whether that be something like, so I'm going to finish 2 of these problems, and then I can give myself a snack, or if I finish these 2 problems, I'm going to go for a walk. Something like that, something that's going to be very manageable, that will allow you to kind of divide things up and take them in a smaller dose at a time, and eventually just kind of stick with that until you finish it. That's something that worked for me in high school. Also in high school, when I wouldn't understand something, or if I was having a very like hard time learning something, I would actually go to YouTube and look up like the keywords that relate to the subject. It's really helpful when it comes to math homework, because of like Common Core, things like that. I struggled a lot as someone who like went to school with dyslexia and ADD, and I eventually had to find ways to understand, but from a different angle. And I think that YouTube is a very good tool for that.
There was one question, it looks like a student might have written it. It says, how can I speak to my mom and dad without feeling like they don't understand me? Which is a big question. And I think we all struggle with it, with a cultural gap, sometimes definitely a generational gap, and potentially a language barrier.
Sorry, can you say the question one more time?
The question was, how can I speak to my mom and dad without feeling like they don't understand me? I think, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, a lot of the conversation tools that we had in the presentation are really helpful, like setting up a specific time, having something such as a safe word, making sure that it's a safe space for both you and your parents to properly have a kind of discourse. And I guess I'm trying to, like a very big piece of that is going to be clarification, and making sure that these feeling that you're understood is going to take a lot more clarification, things like clarifying questions, whether this be notes, asking if the other party understands, specifically asking your parents if they understand what they're how you're feeling in the situation, but trying to frame it also in a way that isn't going to be non-conducive to a healthy conversation. I know that's a very long, complicated answer, but essentially just trying to work on communication skills is going to improve that kind of feeling that you're understood or misunderstood.
I think also if there is like that's a problem I struggle with a lot. I think one thing that might help is like slowing down. Because if you are speaking in English and like your parents have that as their secondary language, it might take them a little longer to like analyze what you're saying and understand it. So talking slower might help. Also, like breaking down what you want to talk about into like different parts. So for example, like providing the context for it first, making sure they understand the context, and then like moving on to the problem, making sure they understand that, and then talking about how you feel, and that's like a third part. So just like breaking it down into smaller conversations and having like a checkpoint where you know they understand that section before moving on.
Mhm. And this is like kind of reiterating, but coming into a conversation with, like when Angela was presenting earlier, she said, either ask or, if you are the student or the child, you can say, I I don't want advice right now. I just want you to listen to me. Or I have a problem and I would like some advice, right? State what you're looking for before you start talking about it. And then ideally establish something like a sign, like pulling on your ears would mean like, listen to me, you're not listening or something. And or like, having that safe word that either means like one might mean stop and one might mean we need to like recollect and listen to each other. And because then that way it can be a little bit of a way to hold the other person accountable or even hold yourself accountable, to when you say things. Um, nice. Someone just said, Angela, you made some very good points. So I got a couple questions that I think I could kind of put into one is, oh no, wait, I typed it on my phone. Kind of just how to watch out for mental health in your children is one of them, and that is a very, very good question and a big one. As well as, knowing benefits and cautions that you might want to be aware of when it comes to psychiatric medications, or antidepressant medication and such.
So these things will look very different for every person, especially when it comes to young people. So these things can kind of snowball. They look very different for everyone else, for everyone, whether it be someone who's withdrawing from friends, or who's showing disinterest in things, oversleeping, overeating, undereating. There's really no one way to specifically, I guess you'd say, identify or like spot mental illness on the spot. There are ways that we can identify signs that can be a bit concerning, such as what I had mentioned, overeating, undereating, withdrawing. It looks very different for each person, really. But when it comes to psychiatric medications, there's a lot to look out for. And once again, it is a case-by-case basis. Not everyone is going to experience the same symptoms when it comes to taking medication. Some people are going to be completely fine. Some people say they feel a bit numb after being on a medication for too long. I've also taken classes in drugs and behavior, and a very large section was on psychiatric medication. And we had discussed, we even had a panel. Some of the panelists had mentioned just kind of looking out for that general numb feeling. Not everyone gets it. Some people do. Depending on the medication, if it's not right for you, it can make you feel a lot more manic or invincible, I guess you'd say, when it doesn't work. But normally you can tell that early on. When it comes to a medication and you're just starting it, with most antidepressants, you need to kind of build an amount within your system within maybe even a couple of months. But when something's wrong, you can normally tell very early on. An example would be like one of my friends had started Prozac. She's on a different medication now and it works completely fine for her, but with Prozac, she felt a little too invincible. And she had told her doctor, like, oh yeah, like I thought that like I could do anything. The doctor's like, okay, like let's try something different. but also when it comes to medication, never feel like you are being pressured into taking medication, or that you're being pressured to come off of your medication. Medication isn't going to be something that needs to be taken your entire life. You can definitely have seasons where you're on it and off of it. Um, and it's very different for everyone, I guess you'd say. Yeah, medication and mental health is really hard to pinpoint because these things look very different for everyone. Like I said, it's a case by case basis.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely, any change in behavior, getting too angry or staying too calm, um, or what's a big alarming behavior is when your child might be very shut in and very like quiet, very down, and then all of a sudden they're happy without much explanation. That might also be a warning sign of something to look into. And if you're trying to ask your child about this, because not all children are willing to share with their parents, and that's an unfortunate truth that we have to deal with sometimes, is make sure that there are adults that your children feel safe with. And I think a big one is make sure that they feel safe asking to go to therapy, and that therapy is not just for people who are not doing well mentally. Therapy is something that everybody could benefit from. So just having that mindset of being open to um, you know therapy for yourself or your children, or even family therapy, um, but showing openness to this will is more likely to have your child open up to yourself or to someone about their mental health. Um, yeah, I don't know if the three of you have other things to add. Maybe not. Yeah, and I think it is hard, but definitely, like, if you are having a hard time figuring out with your children, talking to other adults in their life might be also helpful, because you can ask about their behavior when they're not at home. I mean, probably everyone's at home all the time right now, but when they're not interacting with you, just to kind of see and make sure, like, is this a problem just within the family, or is this a problem that persists every day in their life with everything that they do? Um, yeah, and I definitely recommend that you go to other resources as well, talk to doctors, read books. I think I have a book that I read for a class that I'm taking called The Teenage Brain. It looks like this, earphones because of AirPod, not AirPods, because those aren't AirPods, but um, it's definitely really helpful. The book has a lot of things that they bring up that might be scary, right? So just be cautious when you read it, and don't use it as something to be more paranoid about, but it is a good resource to understand more about the teenage brain, because the brain is very different from childhood and adulthood when someone is in adolescence. Um, this will be my last call for any questions. You can also feel free to email. I don't think I had an email in that, but I did email you all with the Zoom link. So if you have any other questions, you can always feel free to email me there. And yeah, so unless there are any other questions, we'll stay on for a few more minutes, if there are and you wanted to just wait and ask more personally. But other than that, thank you so much for coming tonight. We really appreciate it. And I wish you all the best of luck in, you know, using what you heard today about communication and so on. So yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job, guys. If you can make it to the other meeting just for a little bit to listen to the other group, feel free. But I think Angela, you said you weren't feeling well, and Brian, or no, Brian's not feeling well, and Angela, you have something in a little bit. But yeah, do we have any more questions with those who are still here with us?